And I believe we have an aviation attorney ready to talk who has worked with some of these planes before. I believe, is that all good to go, Carlene?
Right.
All right, so I believe we have aviation attorney Pablo Rojas here. Thank you so much for joining us on such short notice. I know that this is, unfortunately, in your line of work, not an unfamiliar scenario, and it's still preliminary in terms of the information that we have. But I would love to get just your initial thoughts, how you learned about this, and what are your first thoughts after hearing about this?
Sure, and I think Brad hit on a lot of the most important facts that, or seemingly facts that we know so far. I learned about it on the news, maybe like anybody else on the internet. We're based in Miami, but we represent victims nationwide. And once I learned about a plane crash like this is our line of work. We represent victims of plane crashes, and I dug in to learn as much as we can. As you folks were just talking about, we don't know very much right now, but I think Brad nailed it. The flight path that we know so far, the quickness with which the pilots evidently made a decision to turn around and attempt to land again clearly indicates some kind of mechanical issue. Very commonly, when pilots detect an issue with an engine, they detect it right away after takeoff. Takeoff and landing are the two most dangerous parts of any flight. And any kind of mechanical issue could prompt a pilot to say, wait a minute, we gotta get back to land. This is not safe to continue this flight. But very, very commonly, it's an engine. Now, twin engine aircraft, as Brad was just saying, they can fly with just one. Really, you can fly with zero if you have enough speed and you can get aerodynamic lift. But it is more challenging. And as Brad was just saying, I completely agree. I think the fact that there are tree debris and they didn't make it to the runway suggests that they were losing quite a good deal of power. So we could be thinking about issues with one engine. We could be looking at issues potentially with both, because you should be able to land an aircraft like this running on one engine if everything else is going well.
Yeah, and for non-aviation experts, I'm sure that's actually probably pretty shocking to hear. We do know that they were not in the air for very long, as you mentioned. I believe only about 10 minutes from the latest that we heard from officials, them crashing at around 10:15 this morning, and the FAA already on scene investigating. Now, I know, as I mentioned, this is not unfamiliar in your line of work. This particular plane, the Cessna C550, is this one that you have experience with in the past?
Yeah, Cessna's a very big manufacturer of aircraft. Maybe a lot of your viewers or listeners would have heard of it. And the Citation is their business jets. It's sort of a fancier aircraft. There are different models of Citations. And over the years, like many other aircraft, there have been issues reported. There have been fatal crashes. There have been issues reported in the past related to landing gear. But at this early stage, as you say, the FAA and NTSB are on the ground, if not already, very, very soon. They're going to take exclusive jurisdiction over the wreckage. They're going to conduct the investigation, and hopefully, because I think the families of victims, and from what I've seen on social media, unfortunately, there will be probably several fatalities. They're going to want answers quickly about who was on the flight and what the NTSB has come across. At first glance, it doesn't look like a landing gear issue because, as Brad was just explaining, they didn't even make it to the runway. I mean, this was a loss of power. So sometimes the information from prior crashes is helpful. Other times you have to wonder whether there's something else going on here that doesn't have to do necessarily with these planes. The other thing I would mention is, engines on aircraft are to some extent interchangeable. So we're looking at obviously a Cessna Citation jet. But if there was a loss of power issue with one or both of the engines, then one thing to look at is what was the make and model of the engine, which comes from a variety of manufacturers. I think once that information is obtained, I haven't seen it, perhaps other folks have been able to get it in the short time since this crash. One thing that will be important to look at is what is the history of incidents involving that type of engine, not necessarily that type of plane.
That's really helpful information too, because I know when we first got this and we were looking up the Citation and what we know, I know there's multiple configurations and slightly different models. Originally, we were just trying to figure out how many people were on board, and I'm curious if you are able to know that based on the information you have with how many seats there are. But I think that's helpful for people to know too, is that there's multiple things here. It could be different engines, different models that could also impact the situation.
Absolutely. One of the things we often say when talking about these types of tragedies is that typically it's not enough for one thing to go wrong. Several things have to go wrong for something like this to happen. And both aircraft and engine, meaning the body, the fuselage, but then each of the two engines undergo incredibly intensive and frequent maintenance. At least they're supposed to under federal regulations. So there will have been a lot of people that laid hands on this aircraft and engines over the past several months and years, every 100 hours, every year, at different maintenance intervals. And so it's very complex situation technically. I think the NTSB and FAA will get at some initial impression of what went wrong. As Brad was saying, at first glance, it has something to do with the engines. But then I think you'd be looking at questions not only of the design of the aircraft and the design of the engines, but also the maintenance history. Aircraft and engines both are supposed to have very well documented maintenance histories. And one of the first things the FAA and NTSB, and if other folks eventually get involved, lawyers such as ourselves for victims, or any other investigators, they're going to be taking a long, hard look at the maintenance history of whether the aircraft and engines were up to speed with the maintenance that was supposed to be performed, and also whether previous maintenance issues or mishaps had been reported. Sometimes when engines fail, there will be a report that a pilot noticed something that a couple flights ago or a couple months ago that luckily didn't lead to a fatality, and maybe somebody looked at it and signed off on it. Maybe they should have, maybe they shouldn't have. But that type of historical record of previously reported incidents and what type of maintenance was performed is going to be critical in getting answers and getting to the truth of what happened here.
Such helpful information, Pablo. Before we let you go, because I know this is a very busy day and this is just breaking as it's happening, is there anything else we haven't asked about you want people to know?
No, not at all. I think you guys have hit the right points, hit the right questions, and our hearts go out to the victims' families. We deal with this all the time. It's a terrible, terrible thing to happen. This looks like a terrible crash with several fatalities. So I would just close on that note. This is a terrible crash.